Canada, a fascinating country of breathtaking nature, sheer endless expanses, but also modern place, which is by now a lot more than just the little brother of the USA in the north. But deceives this appearance of the world's second largest country's monumental unity?
I'm standing in the middle of Montreal, the largest city in Quebec, or Quebec, how it is pronounced here in Canada's second largest province. Well, at least it is now, but it's not certain that it will stay like this, because there are movements similar to the ones in Catalonia, Scotland, South Tyrol and even Great Britain, as the Brexit vote last year has shown. All of them have in common that lots of the citizens exert themselves for separatism, a divestment from their present country. The motivations for these movements differ massively. And to understand the one of the Canadian province, we have to go back around 250 years, to the early stages of Canada as we know it.
It is the year 1763. The 7 Years' War is coming to an end, and the eastern part of North America is dominated by the colonies of Great Britain and France. As a result of the war, New France was added to the colonies of Great Britain and was renamed Quebec. Due to the failed assimilation of the by French culture and language dominated society of the region to the English rest of the colony, the government enacted the so-called Quebec Act in 1774. It guaranteed the validity of the French civil law, language and freedom of worship to prevent uprisings. Nevertheless, there were political differences every now and then between Quebec and the more and more independent from Great Britain operating rest of Canada throughout the centuries. For example, during World War I, the government wanted to enact a universal compulsory military service. While almost all members of parliament of English origin voted for it, almost all of French origin were against it. The fact that the law was passed against the massive, in some parts of Quebec even violent protests, led to a deep political division of Canada. But it was not until the 1960s when the first calls for independence of the province were raised. In the course of this so-called White Revolution, the public opinion became more and more inclined to the thought of separation, and radical resistance groups wanted to impose it by violence and vandalism. The hate against people of English origin grew in this time, which led to similar reactions by the English population. The last straw that broke the camel's back was a speech by French President Charles de Gaulle, held in Montreal in 1967.
Vive Montréal! Vive le Québec! Vive le Québec libre! Vive le Canada français et vive la France!
I'm standing here right in front of Montreal's town hall. From this very balcony, Charles de Gaulle said the words "Vive le Québec libre" exactly 50 years ago, which should have an impact that no one ever imagined at the time. It was a trigger for the success of the separation campaign, which wasn't really active in the political institution until this point. This change of mind resulted in a referendum about Quebec's independence in 1980. But against all expectations, about 60% of the voters turned down the idea with a firmly no.
This ended the separation efforts for the moment, but in 1982, only 2 years later, the argument was inflamed for a second time. With the constitutional reform, Canada wanted to completely separate itself from Great Britain, but to come into force, all prime ministers of the provinces and territories had to approve it, which they all did, except for Quebec's. That is because he was the only one who was left out of the negotiations and presented with a fait accompli. Nevertheless, the reform was passed and put into force, also valid for Quebec without a signature. This was a huge affront and understood as betrayal. The backlash of this led to a second referendum about independence in 1995, and with 50.58% of the votes against, with a turnout of 93%, the unity of Canada was preserved only by a hair's breadth.
Even though 2 referendums failed, the separation is still a topic here. A reminder of it is to be seen on every car around. On the bottom of the license plates is the sentence "Je me souviens." That means as much as "I remember." which refers to the will to sustain the French roots and is a relic from the 70s and its uprising, nationalism and independence wishes.
Another constant reminder is a law called Law 101, or Charter of the French Language, which stipulates the priority of the French language. That leads to some absurdities. For example, the US-American food chain, a KFC, which is called the same even in France, has to call themselves in Quebec Poulet Frit Kentucky, or PFK for short. But also in politics, the separation-aiming party Parti Québécois still plays a big role, for example in the National Assembly of Quebec, where it even formed a minority government after the 2012 election. In hope of getting an outright majority, they announced early elections in 2014, but against all expectations, they unambiguously lost with 70 to 30 seats to the Canadian unity supporting Parti libéral du Québec. The idea of independence seemed dead. With the Brexit vote in 2016, however, the topic got up once again, which is, considering the election next year, an interesting development. In recent polls, the present government party still has a big lead in front of the Parti Québécois, but the Coalition Avenir Québec, a party which is not particularly for separation, but for more autonomy, is tied with them. Therefore, nothing's really certain yet. So the best thing to do is asking the people who decide and are affected the most by whatever events may follow. The Canadians.
I'm for the independence of Quebec. I guess impartial would be the best answer.
It doesn't really matter to me because it doesn't really affect my life, you know, too much. So
I would say if they want to do it, yeah, go for it. I'm not against it.
I think it's a great idea on papers. It was a great idea, I'm pretty sure. Is it a great idea today? I don't know. I don't think so. I think it used to be a great idea.
I think it's a good idea, but maybe for now it's at this time it's a bit impossible, if I can say, because we already had the two referendum, I think, so and it didn't pass, so.
Oh, okay. I think it is a possible project to have. I think it is not, as some people say, that it would not be realizable economically or politically. I don't believe in that. I do believe it would make us stronger on our choice on cultural decision. We could pretty much make our own cultural politics. Yeah, that's it.
I think I don't know if I thought like I don't know actually. I don't really care because I think like being part of something bigger may be better for like international business economy. I don't know. I don't really know much about the topic, but I don't know. I'm not for. I'm not against because I would need to know more about like the plus and the minus from it. So yeah.
That's a good question, actually. Well, I think that in the past with the referendum that we had, maybe I can understand why they wanted to separate. There's a few like economic reason and like there's a few reasons, but for me, like as a cultural province, like I think the cultural differences are really big between the French part of Canada and the English part of Canada. So I think for this reason, like the Quebecers, they didn't really feel like they belonged to Canada and they wanted to have their own country. So I think at that point it was kind of okay, like if they wanted to separate, and I think it would have been possible to do it. But I think now it's kind of hard because of the globalization, you know? So like all the countries are trying to like get together, all the provinces actually in one country are trying to get together to be like a tourist destination. And like if they want to compete with the other country, they have to stay like really powerful as a country. So if Quebec like just separate from Canada, I think it will be really hard for them to like for the globalization and all the I think it will be really hard for them to just like become super powerful and economically for the tourism and for a few things. So.
Because I love the culture of the Québécois.
Why? Because from like an economic standpoint, Canada doesn't like per se need Quebec, so they don't really want to be a part of Canada. They can go do it. They already have like mostly different laws and a different criminal justice system and stuff like that.
Well, they're not separating so soon in my view. There was a referendum, I recall, in 1997 or 98 where we as a country did not want them to separate, and we still don't, at least as far as I'm concerned, as somebody from Toronto, that I recognize the distinct society that Quebec is, but I think most Canadians would agree with what I say. Okay. I hope.
Okay, so I think the time's passed. I think they were close once. I think I think the younger Quebecers are learning English. They're interested in gravitating towards that the world culture that is going around, you know, sort of English language, English music. Even in France and places like that, their rock musicians are singing in English, and I don't think it's going to happen.
Because if Canada were to say, okay, you're separating, and we were to dislodge them from our economic union, and what they wanted to do before was they wanted to be separate, but they wanted to stay within the economic union of Canada, I don't think Canadians would go for that. So if they realized that they had to be a sovereign country on their own without support of a currency, without support of trade with other provinces, that if they had to do it alone, I think they would realize it would be very difficult. It is a resource-rich province, but nevertheless, if they saw what the reality of separation is, just like they're seeing now with Brexit, I think everyone's sort of shaking their heads and saying this isn't feasible.
I think the time has passed. I think it's. I think there was a time when they felt they weren't getting much from Canada, and also I think politically they've always been left of the typical Canadian, and I don't think that's happening anymore. I think Quebecers and other Canadians are very close to left of center, right? So I think there are fewer irritants.
I don't think so. No.
No. No.
we had two chances and we blew them. I don't know if there's going to be a third one. Actually, if you follow politics right now in Quebec, I don't think it's coming.
I don't know. I feel like more and more, especially in this day and age, more millennials are not as nationalistic, not as prideful as that they're from Quebec as other generations were. You know, so I feel like even if there is a referendum, as you say, it wouldn't be successful, in my opinion.
I don't think it's ever going to happen. Okay. I think we used to have a prime minister in Canada that could have made it happen because he was so shitty with Quebec people, and he was such on the right side of like politics, and we're way much left. But now we have a prime minister that is way more on the same ideology that Quebec people are. So I think that we're moving away from independence.
I don't think so in the near future, especially right now we have a Prime Minister with a French-Canadian background, and I think they would be foolish to do so. I don't know enough about Quebec politics, but I don't think there's a big support for this right now.
I don't think so. No, because now there's a lot of immigrants that are coming to Quebec, and they're coming to Canada. Like their first idea is, now I'm going to Canada, and sometimes they are going to Vancouver, Toronto, or Quebec. So for them, they don't really know the idea of why Quebec should separate from Canada, and they want to be in Canada and not in the Quebec country. So I think there's a lot of immigrants that anyway they will say no. So, and then I think those people are more like our parents or grandparents that they wanted to separate from Canada. So.
I think so. I think if the previous Prime Minister had been there for another term, people would have been confronted to decisions that are not in their best benefits, and therefore I think the movement was growing up in the last like 5 or 6 years, and I think it's going to go down now that we have a Prime Minister that's more progressive.
No, I don't think so. I think separation is not on the most of Quebecers' heart. I think it's an old concept, and I think no one believes in the independence today. Few people do believe in it, but I don't think it's global in the country.
No, I think it's becoming more and more a personal fight, and people don't gather together to make it like to go forward for that project.
So after traveling for a while, I came to the conclusion that the world doesn't need one more border. So, and making Quebec a country could be a really good thing to preserve our culture, our French culture, culture that's really different in Canada, and sometimes the federal government doesn't agree or doesn't try to integrate the culture of Quebec inside Canada. So for those reasons it would be a good idea, but on a higher level, just having another border in the world doesn't help the racism, sexism, all are big world problems. And what's happening with Trump right now and the walls of Mexico, I don't want my province to have this kind of idea. Yeah, so I think we can be a happy country inside of Canada. Canada is a beautiful country, and yes, we don't have the same ideas and the same vision of how we can use our money, how we can use our resources. But even then, it just means that we need to find a way to work together and find a way to stay in a really multicultural country with different opinions, and I think that's it. That's my opinion.